Normally, those of you who've been here to the School of Authentic Journalism before know that it begins with a speech by me. This year, we thought it would be better to invite two of our students to conduct an interview with me. Those journalists are Mariana Simoes of Brazil and Giovanni Montalvo of El Salvador. This is the first time in the School of Authentic Journalism we've been able to organize the videotaping of most of our sessions, done by the Viral Video Group with an important assist from the Documentary Group.
Bien. ¿Cómo se involucró Al Giordano en el periodismo? Y si su relación con Abby Hoffman influyó en esa decisión de ser periodista.
Well, we're very honored tonight to have with us Abby's widow, Johanna Lawrenson, who with Abby were the first people to take me to Latin America, to Nicaragua in 1984. For those of you who don't know, Abby Hoffman was a very notorious dissident in the United States in the 1960s and 70s. He was one of the few of his generation that took an interest in the younger generation. But this was a man who knew that you had to invest in the next generation to keep the wheels of change turning. During those years, I was a community organizer, organizing specifically to shut down a nuclear power plant in Massachusetts. And 30 years later, I'm still here, and that nuclear plant no longer exists. But working as what I defined as a community organizer at the time, what many of us called being activists at the time, became increasingly frustrating to me. I didn't think a lot of the activists were serious people. They liked to have long meetings and talk a lot. And those who talked more did less, and those who didn't talk so much were the ones doing all the work. So one day it occurred to me I could do the same kind of work if I called myself a journalist, and then I wouldn't have to attend meetings anymore. And I went to a friend of mine who was a reporter and got one of these spiral notebooks. And I realized I had this whole script written in my head for what paper I would claim to work for if anybody asked me. And later, after 8 hours of interviewing all kinds of people in the street and very famous people, I realized once they saw the spiral notebook, nobody questioned whether I was a journalist or not, and nobody asked me what media I worked for. I consider my journalism to be an extension of my organizing. Some people might organize fishermen. Some people might organize among farmers. Some people might organize among neighbors. I consider my work to be organizing among journalists and communicators.
So on that note, what does community organizing have in common with authentic journalism?
The difference between authentic journalism and phony journalism is the phony journalists are always looking up above at what the people in power are doing. For example, this summer, after the coup d'etat in Honduras, the right wing kept saying, well, this is all about Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, and some aspects of the left wing were saying, oh, this is all about Barack Obama in the United States. And very few journalists, with the exception of some of the people we have here and a few others, were looking at what was happening on the ground in Honduras and what the people of Honduras wanted, which was lost in this whole debate over whether it was Venezuela or Washington. And so authentic journalism looks below. It literally points the camera lens to the ground level and points the microphone to the ground level to listen to what the common and humble people are saying and doing and what the desires are of the people on the ground. In that sense, it's identical to community organizing.
Por lo que usted acaba de decir, podemos afirmar de que la Escuela de Periodismo Auténtico es una organización comunitaria.
Yes and no, because it's not really an organization. It's a school. It's an invitation. It's also a party. And it's a celebration. When you go to a party at a friend's house, you can't really say, well, that's community organization, even though it is. Whereas it is organization at the base level. It's not an organization in terms of having meetings and debates and taking votes and making decisions. Because every decision that is made is going to be made by each and every individual one of you when you leave the school about whether and how you apply the skills you learn. In other words, it's not one organization, but right now in this room or in this space, it's 55 different organizations made up of one individual.
Okay, let's go back to the application for the School of Authentic Journalism. We'd like to ask you a question that you asked us, the applicants, in the application, which was, are an activist and an organizer the same thing? If not, how are they different?
It's that a lot of people who call themselves activists are mainly involved trying to recruit people that already think like them to go out and protest and march and do things to get media attention. Whereas an organizer is different. An organizer goes out and knocks on doors and makes phone calls and tries to reach the regular or everyday people who don't necessarily already agree with him and her. And so I think it's important to have our terminology straight as reporters when we're covering people who are trying to change the world or trying to change their communities. My bias, and an authentic journalist should always admit his bias, is in favor of the organizers because I think they accomplish so much more than mere activists.
Should any kind of speech be prohibited at a journalism school, and why?
That's another question from the application. You're turning the tables on me. The short answer is no. There's a lot of problems in academia and in universities, particularly in the developed world, where they spend so much time worrying about what people should be allowed to say or not allowed to say because it might offend somebody. In this school, you have the right to offend anybody else. But careful, because they have the right to respond to you too. However, there are two forms of speech that I would like to discourage. One, boring speech. Number two is long monologue speech. And that's why instead of having earphones to do the translation here, we pause and do the translation live.
Esta es la razón por la que no los tenemos a todos conectados con un chicharito en el oído, sino que tomamos pausas y nos vamos traduciendo unos a otros.
Because there are many people who are experts in never pausing, and you can't even interrupt them to try to get them to give somebody else a chance to talk. But with this process, there's always the chance to kind of say, okay, let's hear from somebody else now. It's not the content of long speech that's the problem, it's that it displaces everybody else's right to speak.
All right, our last question for you, Al, is that you once said that journalism is in a state of crisis, and elaborated on this by announcing that journalists are all looking for that vision thing that journalism once knew, but at some point between the deadlines and market pressures passed like an ancient civilization into obscurity. How is the vision proposed by the School of Authentic Journalism different from the one promoted by other journalism schools?
The official journalism schools teach is that a journalist is supposed to be objective. Any journalist that tells you that he's objective is either a con artist liar or is so unself-aware that his observations of what goes on around him can't be trusted. Because if journalism is about being honest, it's about being honest with ourselves too. I've never met an objective journalist because all the journalists I've met are human beings. And objectivity is impossible for a human being. When the history of this epoch of journalism is written, the objective period was very short-lived. And it will be seen as a failed experiment, and I don't think people will take it seriously.
Hemos escuchado algunas dificultades que ha tenido la escuela y hasta el momento. ¿Cuáles son los retos y los desafíos de la escuela?
We're trying to make the transition to share the lessons of this school with the wider public audience, so that it's not just the 50 or 60 of you that are able to attend, say, a plenary session on how to write a news story, but that we will share that session with the entire world through what is available now that wasn't available the last time we did the school, which is online video. And the other immediate goal I have is really comes out of my experience spending a good deal of the summer in Honduras. It is very hard for any social movement or civil resistance to develop its own strategy and tactics if it doesn't count with journalists and communicators that understand the underlying strategic dynamics of how you make a civil resistance or a social movement victorious. We journalists have to learn how to think like strategists and tacticians in order to better be able to report on those organizers and strategists and movements that are trying to make changes and defend what is good and change what is bad in their communities and in their countries and in this world. Some of you have already a lot of experience in this and know what I'm talking about. And others are going to be hearing from people suggesting ways to think strategically this week that may be newer to you. So in addition to teaching the nuts and bolts of how you do journalism, whether it's investigative journalism, online journalism, viral video, or documentary filmmaking, I'm going to be sharing, 30 years of experiences being on both sides of the microphone as an organizer of social movements and as a dissident, and then later on as a dissident journalism. Some of my strategic thoughts, and I've invited some other great strategic thinkers to come and do the same. Because the other thing we have to face facts on is, when we report something, we also change the thing we're reporting. It's a thing called, is it the Heisenberg principle? Yeah, where you can't study something without changing it. And when you report on the way you report on social movements can affect whether those social movements can develop enough traction to become victorious or not. In that sense, we are not apart from the movements we cover. We are often part of them. Because if as workers of journalism and communications, we're going to fight for our own freedom of speech and expression, and we're going to fight for our own rights, we have to have solidarity with everybody else fighting for theirs. I don't believe that freedom of speech should only be for journalists. And I don't believe that only professionals can be journalists. We have to democratize journalism and make it a tool that is available and of use to every citizen trying to better his life, her life, and their community's lives. 2009 became the year that the average citizen began to dominate international television news coverage of important civil resistances. And what happened? The international news networks became dependent on videos made by private citizens on their cell phones, usually, and uploaded to the internet, and the coverage was actually much better when it came from the individual citizens than when it came from the big corporate TV crews. So we want you to be the pioneers of this great shift that is happening.